this conversation. But thank you all so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm Jens Hilke, a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And also with us today, Keith Thompson and Lincoln Frasca. Keith is with the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Rec, and Lincoln is also with me at Community Wildlife Program. So over the next hour, our plan is to have snippets of conversation and show you a series of videos that the Agency of Natural Resources has produced called Forest Matter. And we want to get at these concepts of forest integrity and forest fragmentation and talk more about forests. I think this will bring in topics of management and how we consume resources and how we develop. Keith, what are some of your first thoughts here?
Well, I am really excited about these videos and sharing them, and I think that they get at the core of Vermont to a large degree. I think forests are hugely important for so many values, and they've got inherent value in the biodiversity that they provide, water quality they provide, clean air, and then just for our lives. They have, they're a place to rejuvenate and recreate and live our lives, and they provide the backdrop not just for our kind of day-to-day lives, but just an economic foundation as well. The recreation elements, the resources. Most of us, as we look around our homes and our spaces, are filled with wood, and so we depend on them for what they provide inherently beyond us. We also depend on them directly for our own needs, and figuring out how to let them do what they do while meeting our very human needs is a tricky balancing act, and a really important one to strike.
Yeah, so you mentioned some of those economic benefits, some of those community benefits, and of course, those ecological benefits. I'll also add, I think a lot about our forests and our pattern of forests in the context of climate resilience. And so not only how important forests are today, but even more so moving into the future. And I think about, climate resilience, both in the context of filtering water and reducing flooding, those services that forests provide, and also sequestering carbon and providing space for wildlife movement into the future as they adjust their home ranges in the face of a changing climate. So those are some of the issues we're going to be talking about. Folks, you all should feel free to use the chat function to ask questions or offer your thoughts. We'd love to have you part of this conversation. But let's just go ahead and show that first introductory video, and we'll get things kicked off.
Whatever the question is, forests are the answer. If we're talking about the state's economic vitality, or the state's water quality, or the role the state is playing in climate mitigation, moving forward, forests are a fundamentally defining characteristic of Vermont, and they are really part of what makes us strong.
Intact forests support diverse wildlife.
Trees are really good at maintaining the health of water, the water table and surface waters, and flood resilience.
On the economic side, intact forests mean productive forests, and so we can support forest product industries at the same time as drawing in visitors that, of course, like to look at the fall color, but also to spend time on our trails, recreating in a variety of ways throughout the year.
It's easy to think that because things haven't happened to your forest, they're not going to happen. And that is not the case, unfortunately. We have intense development pressure coming our way.
We are seeing increasing fragmentation of our forests in Vermont. We've been documenting this at Vermont Natural Resources Council.
While we still have a lot of tree cover, Our forest pattern has changed from large, continuous, intact blocks to increasingly smaller and smaller blocks.
We know that intact forests are more productive forests. That means maintaining or at least encouraging these large forest blocks to remain the way that they are.
You know, a road in a forest may not seem that big of a deal to you and me. If we were to saw your car in half, well, it's still your car. It's just got this crack in the middle, and we all go, well, then it's not going to work, right?
Act 171 is a response to those changes to try and keep our forests as intact as possible and maintain a landscape pattern of intact forest.
It shines a spotlight on the importance of forests, and it really asks communities to think about identifying these important areas and trying to plan for the integrity of these areas into the future. So in 2018 is when the planning provision went into effect, and since then, as towns revise their town plan, they need to look at this particular provision.
Those variety of different both economic, cultural, and ecological values, I think many towns often maybe not put an emphasis on, but this new requirement has kind of elevated that to ensure people are thinking more deeply about these places that they care about and they have respect for and that they rely on as part of their town's identity.
We're trying to influence the location of development to make sure that we can have development, but also preserve the forest blocks so that they can support a greater diversity of uses.
Towns aren't limited to a certain outcome or implementation measure. There's a lot of flexibility within the act that allows communities to set forth a vision that really is unique to them.
There's just an amazing wealth of information that's available to municipal groups.
We've seen a doubling of communities that are now addressing these resources. So that's to say that Act 171 is having an important effect in this planning, and we think that's really positive for the state.
From a long-range planning perspective, Act 171 is basically kind of that spark. It's that thing that sets that conversation off.
It's exciting to see this level of effort going into protecting a common resource that really supports the state of Vermont.
The cumulative impact of what each of the towns does in total creates the pattern of Vermont's forests and waters and ultimately our landscape and the type of lifestyle we all get to enjoy.
There was a lot in that one. Certainly, we brought up some of those economic, ecological issues and talked about the role that towns play. Keith, what are you thinking about as you saw this first video?
I think just it always strikes me how easy it is to lose track of the kind of collective benefit of healthy forests being connected and kind of resulting in healthy forests. And we've got a role to play in maintaining healthy forests, but part of our role is letting them maintain their own health, kind of maintain their capacity for self-renewal. And I think that the role of towns in thinking about where to grow and where to do that less is a really, really important part of that. There are other parts as well, but I think that communities have an outsized role to play in shaping the forests of Vermont.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. 83% of Vermont is in private hands. And so the state owns about 8%, and the federal government owns about 8 or 9%. And so the vast majority of it is in private hands. And very little of the subdivision or the development that's happening statewide actually gets triggered by Act 250. So as you say, the towns really do play a huge role in determining the future of our forests and what that looks like and what sort of pattern that takes. It also makes me, that brings me and my work into thinking about the town planning process. And I just want to let everyone know that, as we said at the end of that video, there are a lot of different resources available to towns to engage in this kind of planning and to think about forests as part of the balancing act in all of these different things that we're planning for. The regional planning commissions are an excellent technical assistance provider. They already work with most of the towns, all the towns in Vermont, to help them when they're doing the town plan work and zoning or regulatory work. So they're an excellent source of information for you. Lincoln and I are our staff for the Community Wildlife Program at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And we do technical assistance at the municipal level. We work hand in hand with a lot of the regional planning commissions and really focus on interpreting the science to help bring that into the planning process. I also want to give a shout out to the county foresters. Keith, can you tell us more there?
Yeah, sure. The county foresters are state employees who provide technical assistance to owners of private forest land. And so if there are questions that landowners have about how to take care of their forest, to manage it both for economic values or other values, they can help landowners figure out how to do that. One of the really important roles they play is helping people navigate Vermont's current use program, which is a program for folks, if you don't know, to enroll their property, to commit to maintaining it as forest land or productive agricultural land and managing it according to a forest management plan. And county foresters play a role in helping evaluate those plans and ultimately maintaining that forest as forest land. I'll throw the link to their contact information in the chat.
Great. Also for landowners, we have two different online maps, the ANR's Atlas and Natural Resource Atlas and the BioFinder website. And both of those are great sources of information for landowners to put their forest land in this much larger context and see that ecological context that spans parcel boundaries and town boundaries and regional planning commission boundaries, and understand their land in that much larger context. So some of those online mapping resources can also be helpful in thinking, what role are forests playing on my land or in my town, and what's that larger pattern? A lot of times we don't necessarily see that larger pattern. So we are talking about municipalities and forests, and we're going to go through this 5-step process for how towns plan and how we can integrate forests into that planning. So Lincoln, would you go ahead and play that step 1 video in our planning process?
For towns to engage in when thinking about forest integrity is getting a sense of where are their largest forest blocks and where are their connections between those forest blocks. Online mapping tools like BioFinder or the Natural Resource Atlas are really excellent ways for towns to figure out that pattern of forest integrity.
Most of the resources that you need to do this from a background resources perspective already exist. And the help that you can get from Jens and his colleagues is really quite beneficial as well. And that really makes the process a whole lot easier.
The regional planning commissions can do two things. One, they can help synthesize that information, distill down the main points that your town needs to care about, and they can put it in context for where your town fits with other towns, right? What are other towns trying in terms of zoning to address forest fragmentation and conversion? What are other towns doing in terms of thinking about connectivity blocks?
We've created a website that actually tracks parcelization or subdivision in Vermont, and you can look at trends both at your community level, regionally. You can look at it across the state and use that kind of information then to inform your planning.
You have Jens at the state level, a whole variety of people who will come and talk to you about what this stuff means and why you should do it.
So the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative created forest conversion risk maps to help regional planning commissions, towns understand where on the landscape they might see forest conversion in the future.
Any of our citizens can access this information and use it and be a part of the planning process. They also allow for communication between townspeople because you can create a map of the forest blocks in your town and email it to other members of the Planning Commission or the Conservation Commission.
We used our resources from Agency of Natural Resources in a tool called BioFinder. Maps with multiple layers that you can look at things like, wetlands and different kinds of habitat, vegetation.
Forests don't abide by arbitrary lines. They function across those boundaries, across those scales, and while they all matter, we really need to be making sure that we can work at multiple scales and consider the resolution of our work.
Maybe the best thing, at least for me, that we got from the BioFinder website was seeing how Richmond and its pieces add up with our neighboring towns to make some really fantastic places. We know now that we are part of a corridor that wildlife can use to get from the southern greens north to the northern greens. Any one place can be fabulous for wildlife, but to really be rich and to stay that way for generations means we need to be working together.
On the mapping side, it was super helpful that the Regional Planning Commission was involved. So in Chittenden County, the Regional Planning Commission provides mapping and GIS expertise for all of the communities. Their work was essentially free in the sense that they did that work as a function of the dues that we pay as a member municipality. So the project didn't have to bear that cost.
We're seeing shifts in land use and development in a way that we haven't in the past, and so because of that, we need to plan ahead and use these tools to ensure that as that development happens, we don't lose those ecological features that are so important on this landscape.
We often talk about this concept of forest integrity. And Keith, can you tell us more from your standpoint? What does that mean?
I think I said it earlier. I mean, in part, it's an area that's got the capacity for self-renewal, and it can do what forests do best, and provide the values that we listed before, from biodiversity, clean water, clean air, the ability for wildlife to move, things like that. And the reality is that you don't get forest integrity with a handful of trees in one spot. You really need to have big connected areas for species to move and trees to be able to grow up and die, for places to be able to be managed for some of their resources to some degree, and other places to not be managed and to be left alone. And so I think forest integrity is really that capacity for self-renewal while providing the values that we really depend on it for.
Yeah, and for me, that concept you just mentioned the connected forests. And for me, that's a big part of forest integrity, is thinking about the connections between forests. Even smaller blocks of forest often behave as if they're bigger in terms of the species that we might get in there when they're connected. And in Vermont, we still do enjoy a relatively connected forest pattern. Increasingly in some of the valleys, the Connecticut River Valley and the Champlain Valley, we are seeing more forest fragmentation. And so the connections between blocks become even more important, because that's what's holding the whole network together. And so even in those valleys, we have many more species actually than we do on the top of Mount Mansfield. But those connecting lands can be hard to spot, or their value is maybe underestimated. Because they don't have the long list of ecological values that you might get in the deep, dark woods, and yet their context as connecting larger blocks of forest is such an important function in and of itself. But again, this brings me back to that sort of matrix of like, well, okay, we want this pattern of core forests and connecting lands, but who owns that land, and how do we work in that context of private lands? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that there are so many factors that can affect the current condition of a forest in the moment, and that play out on private lands, and that can be the wind blows and trees fall down. It could be that there's forest management activity and some trees are harvested and then allowed to regenerate. There could be some areas can be converted to agriculture or development. And as it relates to forest integrity, I mean, a lot of these are the choices of private landowners, and some of them have a greater impact on forest integrity than others. And I think one of the things that some folks have wrestled with, particularly recently, is, what does it mean to lose forest integrity or for deforestation to occur? And I think it's really helpful to be thinking about if when we're talking about losing forest integrity, loss of forest land, deforestation, conversion from forest to a non-forest condition is really the main thing that we're talking about. There are other really important impacts to forest that need to be considered. There is forest management that needs to be done well. There are diseases and pests or disturbances, blowdown of trees, that can affect forest land, absolutely. But those conditions where forests will regenerate are very distinct from deforestation, from conversion. And so as we're thinking about where do we need to really be investing our energy to keep the breadth of values that forests provide and maintain forest integrity, we do need to pay attention to the full range of potential impacts, but dealing with conversion and dealing with deforestation is really the first issue to tackle. And really what I think an important area for communities to play a role in to really affect forest integrity and maintain it for the long term.
Yeah, thanks so much. I couldn't agree with you more. As we think about bringing those forests into the communities and the community setting, let's go ahead and look at the second step in our video series.
The community depend on the forest. They depend on the opportunities, and the folks in the community depend on the forest. They depend on the opportunities in the town, whether it's to start a business or to build a home. And those values are all real. And striking the balance between protecting forest resources and supporting the opportunities that help the community thrive, we need to strive to make them compatible. And understanding those needs is a prerequisite to striking that right balance.
The planning process is identifying goals and values and shared commonalities amongst those in your community and with your neighbors. And so it's really important just to hear the voices of everyone and making significant effort to reach out to those that are typically not in the room at your regularly scheduled programs.
But try to identify those places where people are gathering in your community and go out and talk to people about it. And that can be really informal, and it can be a great way to have conversations that aren't necessarily focused on a particular rule or regulation.
We ran a number of events. We did a paddle along the Winooski River with naturalists talking along the way. We had the county forester come and do talks for landowners and how they can manage their land to make it more friendly to wildlife. We had a few classes with school kids. We did a number of videos with our local community TV station. We did a couple bird walks, bike rides, just a number of ways to get people connected.
The first task that we talked about doing was community engagement. And I said, I know I can get at least 10 people there, because I knew 10 people on my road. So I thought, we can do this, right? It's not that hard. And I went literally walking down the road, talking to my neighbors, going, please come. So I had a lot of neighbors who participated, but then we published it on Front Porch Forum. Well, it turns out food is a huge motivator. So we had our first community engagement meeting at Smiley, and I think we had like 100 people come. It was unheard of.
We did do value mapping, and it was a great way to both learn and to bring people together. We all sat down around some huge maps, and people just started circling places that mattered to them. And even on those tables where we had people that did not agree with each other on many things, when they started seeing that they both liked a certain area for the view, or because they went hunting there, or because they like to walk their dog there, they actually started talking together. It was a great chance to learn from everybody and to see what matters to all of us.
Huge forest blocks will get circled in community value mapping as important for a variety of reasons, from economic development like working forests, to recreation, to scenic values or historical values. And so we do see that overlap that comes out very clearly in a lot of the community value mapping exercises that I've been engaged in.
In many places where you're doing work around large forest block habitats, there are not a lot of owners because they're large forest blocks, and they may be very large parcels. And so you may want to talk to those people individually or get them all in the room together. And you can do that through the grand list and go, okay, who are all these parcels out there? So find out what's important to them.
Whenever we do a town plan update, we do surveying of the community, articles in the local paper and front porch forum, posts to just gauge interest and raise awareness about those issues.
Whatever way you can connect with people, because without the connection, there's not going to be any conversation.
So the concept of community value mapping was mentioned a couple of times in that segment, and that's basically getting as many people into the room as you can, whether it's a real room or a virtual room, and saying, what do you love about living here, and getting them to circle different areas. So that's a strategy that's a little different than survey because it's spatially explicit. And it also helps clarify when we want conflicting things. I want economic development here and I want conservation there. The being spatially explicit about that can really help. So community value mapping is an activity we do a lot. We facilitate a lot with towns across Vermont as a way of helping to identify what the community cares about, and then we can overlay that with ecological priorities. But it also gets me thinking about who doesn't show up at those events and who's not at the table. Keith, what are your thoughts there as we think about this idea of community participation and bringing people to the table?
I think just more importantly than ever, it's important to bring everybody to the table. And I think culturally, we see a lot of divisiveness. At the same time, I think there's forests have never been understood to be so important. They've always been so important, but the understanding is there now. And so I feel like we're at a fork in the road as a culture where we need to figure out a path forward. And I really feel like the way forward is together. And I think that community value mapping to really cultivate that shared understanding of shared interest is really important. It's also really helpful to understand and hear each other. Oh, you see this area as really important. I've never really paid attention to that. What's so valuable about that? And we each have our own perspectives, and doesn't mean that there won't be conflicts to be navigated, but I think recognizing we all have values and we want to perpetuate those values on the landscape by striking the right balance is really important, and get that community conversation going. So their shared ownership is really important.
Great, thank you. So that was the identifying community values step, and now we're going to move into identifying goals. How does the community want to move forward? What's the vision for moving forward? Lincoln, would you go ahead, please?
want to identify goals and policies to move us forward. And this is no different than what we've been doing for years, having these community discussions about what we want our future to look like and identifying goals and policies that get us there.
It is a real challenging thing to figure out what's right for the town, what's right for the forest as a whole, what's unique about our forests that really deserve protection, but also what are the values and strategies that we really need to support in our forests.
There are a variety of different benefits for a town to recognize the value of their forests and take steps towards maintaining them. Looking at it from a hazard mitigation standpoint, we do have some mountainous areas with some steep valleys. Ensuring that those wooded hillsides are in place can really help slow the flow of any stormwater, rainwater that's coming down through those valleys that ultimately end up in our broad river valleys and have created flooding. Also, the benefits from looking at it from the perspective of ensuring that there are places for people to go out and recreate. The municipality may also own a municipal forest, and that is a great asset to a town, and it does take some conversations about the purpose of that municipal forest, but you could be serving dual purposes as a municipality, being a forest owner, owning your municipal forest, and how you choose to manage that forest. So in thinking about your identified goals and strategies and policies that have been identified through the planning process, it's always good to identify tangible actions and identify actions that you know that are going to be realistic and ones that are within the scope of maybe the Volunteer Planning Commission or other people in town.
We can do something as simple as, in our region, say, well, you can look at our regional plan, and we have a whole series of policies around the forest area. And you can just, basically, regional plans have the same statutory requirements as town plans. You can just take our policies if you want.
So it's not for me as a state employee to decide what the tool is that the towns will use, but there's a whole spectrum of options that towns can choose from. So on the regulatory end, think about the town plan or the zoning or subdivision bylaws. There are tools there that can help regulate the pattern of the landscape.
Also think about those non-regulatory actions that you can undertake. Holding workshops or providing information to people, having walks in the woods.
Providing opportunities for willing landowners to engage with land trusts and do conservation easements. Even land management. Vermonters have been doing good land management for years. That's a critically important piece of maintaining forest integrity across the state.
Often those non-regulatory actions are those ones that can have some great impact.
Forests are central to our way of life and should be central to our land use planning.
I guess the biggest lesson I learned was just to not be afraid to do it. So it was a little daunting to look at the overall town, and especially this eastern side of Heinsberg that's mostly forested, and try to come up with a map that would indicate where the most important areas were. And I think it was largely with the help of staff at Vermont Fish and Wildlife to say, well, here's what we've seen from a landscape level analysis of the region and the overall state. And they were able to talk about what forest blocks were most important from a statewide perspective. A lot of what we do when it comes to looking beyond our borders comes with assistance from others that have that larger lens. So Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, helps us on that front, keeps us aware of the larger landscape that wildlife work and live within. And the Regional Planning Commission, as I said, also helps us in that regard.
We have a very long, strong history of anti-land use regulation here. They're very much in favor of being able to do with my property what I want to do, and a lot of that has to do with handing it down to the next generation and talking to people about ways to ensure that they are able to do that without breaking up the forests. So we're looking at things like conservation easements and possibility of town forests and groups of citizens getting together to conserve land, and just talking to landowners about the value of keeping forest land intact. It's really important to reach out to individual landowners and talk with them about the value that their property has in remaining intact.
Neat. So we're at this stage of, we've just moved from that identifying community values to identifying the community goals. And I just wanted to pick up on one piece here, and that's really making sure there's agreement on the problem before you select the tools. And oftentimes I'll see communities that I work with kind of jump to the solution before there's real clarity on the problem. And the advantage of getting that clarity on the problem is you can bring in people with very different views and identify, I think about a Venn diagram, you know, with overlapping circles, and that sweet spot in the middle is that where everyone agrees there's a problem. And the more clarity you can get as a town on what's the problem, the easier it is then to select the tools and the goals for moving forward. So that's a huge piece in some of the trainings that Lincoln and I offer. We talk a lot about those steps on making sure there's clarity on the problem, and not just having to convince one group or another after another on that, but really bringing everyone in the first place to agree on that problem statement. And then the whole selection of tools piece becomes a lot easier, the non-regulatory tools as well as the regulatory tools, because there's clarity on what we're trying to fix. So that's, I think, part of what I found really interesting here as we think about community goals moving forward. At the end there, Linda mentioned the handing on to the next generation piece. And I wanted to get your take on that, Keith, as we think about how, you know, by 2030, a quarter of Vermonters are 65 and older. What are the effects there on the future of our forests?
Our forests are changing on their own, but the choices we make individually and as communities are accelerating that. I think that as we increase our understanding of our dependence on our landscape, I think that there's going to be an increased appreciation of local responsibility and dependency on local resources, and we can only lean on our local resources if we protected them appropriately and effectively. I think I reflect on how dependent we are on our forests outside of Vermont. I mean, Vermont, covered in forests, consumes vastly more wood than we produce, despite our land cover. And it's interesting, and there's all sorts of reasons for that, but I do think that it's important to reflect on, you know, how are we taking care of this, and how do we grow our communities and develop in ways that support those needs while also maintaining those continued our growing dependency on our landscape and those resources. So, and I don't think it's just a pie in the sky kind of bleeding heart type proposition. I think it's a fundamentally practical reality that we need to take care of our forests, and I think in doing so, they're going to take care of us in really meaningful ways, from clean water to resources to just managing our own personal health because of the landscape we live in. So I think that we have an obligation to ourselves and to the next generations to really take care of that. And that takes a lot of different strategies.
Yeah, and we're gonna pick up on that lot of different strategies piece here in this next video as we move from this idea of identifying a community goal to mapping out the future and you selecting the tool and then deciding what that future case in the context of the town plan. It's the future land use map. what do we want that future condition to look like that incorporates these community goals, these ecological goals in a way that can sustain us? Lincoln, please.
Goals and policies that would enable this connected forest condition. In the fourth step, we want to create a future land use map, and that's a required part of the town planning process, which is to really develop a map of what you want where into the future.
We often recommend to towns to think about this map as a conceptual picture of what they want their future to be. So it's not necessarily a representation of what their town is today or what their zoning regulations specify. We ask towns to think about it as a vision for the future. Identify general land use areas and their associated purposes as what you want them to be in the future.
And that's an important piece of this, because it ensures that there's an integration of this pattern of forest blocks and connectors into all of the other goals that we've been planning for, and that it's spatially explicit. Large forest blocks tend to show up there. The connectors in particular don't often show up in the future land use plan. And so you won't actually maintain this forest pattern of blocks and connectors unless it gets into the future land use map. So there's an opportunity here to get beyond large zones and really plan at a more micro level of where forests connect to one another.
It's really beneficial to be able to identify on your future land use map where those forested areas are that we want to be able to maintain into the future, so that then subsequently anything that happens in those areas can be in alignment with what that future vision is. The also necessary part of that future land use map is it basically sets the foundation for any zoning changes into the future.
It gets to be a little bit harder then to decide, well, what are the policies that we'd like to promote? And so we have published community strategies for Vermont's Forest and Wildlife Guide that's full of different regulatory or non-regulatory strategies or policies that towns could consider and then put into their town plan as action steps.
As we think about planning for land use across a whole town, we're trying to engage as many different people and as many different types of people within the town boundary as we possibly can. A great way to do that is through engaging different groups and engaging in partnerships in particular. There's no rule that says it's just a planning commission or just a conservation commission that's responsible for doing the work.
Local partnerships are really good bases of knowledge for what's on the ground, as well as other people who may be in the future able to implement certain actions and put forth policies that your community has developed as part of the planning process. They also are able to be an essential role within the community outreach and engagement and reaching out to a lot of the people who may be underserved in the community.
All plans and all regulations start at the Planning Commission, they end at the Select Board. So Select Boards are going to be important parts of this conversation. So be talking to the Select Board. Figure out what the Select Board is willing to do and not do.
Which actually brings up another important point, how important it is to select things that are actually achievable and to really ensure that the tool that's chosen is doable over a few year period, that the town has the capacity to make it happen, and then can, in the implementation step, can set people as responsible for making that happen and assign milestones that will allow for that to happen in a reasonable time frame.
There's never like a silver bullet that you invent something. We utilize the mapping and the language in our town plan from earlier days, earlier plans. We made it better. We added bits and pieces to it, and we tried to draw a picture of what was most important. But it wasn't as if, we said, we're going to sit down and just figure this out from scratch. You're always building on what the community's past vision is and where you think it's going in the future.
We have a lot of towns where most of the town is rural residential in terms of a plan. And so it doesn't look any different out here in the big blocks of forest than it looks along the roads if you were to look at their maps. Well, that means that you want people to build out here in the forest just like you want them to build along your roads. And if you don't mean that, make a different map. Make a map that says less down here, more over here. And make a rule that says less down here, more over here. And that way, you don't have to wait until somebody comes along and you go, well, I never thought that that person would sell that lot and then this person would come in. Well, what crazy person would build down there? Well, the person who looked at your rules and plans that said, they'll let me do it.
Much of the forest and the wildlife that is in the forest, they don't adhere to municipal boundaries. So it's really valuable to kind of look beyond those boundaries and see how they could be working with towns to make sure that any policies that they have about protecting forest land will then be kind of compatible with the neighboring towns. So then those policies and goals will actually be able to be implemented on a broader level and have those greater benefits that everybody is hoping for.
So in that one, we talked a lot about the future land use map and sort of this mix of regulatory and non-regulatory tools. And of course, you know, there's a broad range of options in moving forward. And towns tend to sort of self-identify as being more inclined towards non-regulatory tools or regulatory tools. But I think a mix of those tools is always really important. And I'll just flag, you know, outreach and education and engagement is a tool that you want to use no matter what else you're doing. And the more you can bring your citizens along with you and explain why these issues are important and will be even more important into the future, it is critically important. I also just want to pick up on the people. These interviews are that in the videos are a mix of outstanding professionals and also local leaders, movers and shakers who get things done. And I recognize many of the names of folks on this webinar as local leaders and movers and shakers. And I just think it's so important that there is local leadership. And leadership is going to look differently with different people. We all have different leadership styles. But the importance of having somebody at the local level who's going to push to move things forward. And of course, it's for the towns to decide what they're pushing forward. But just having that local leadership to encourage forward momentum, I think is really critically important. Keith, what are your thoughts here as we think about local leadership and this mix of regulatory and non-regulatory tools? What's going on in your head?
Well, I was reflecting on the leadership part, particularly as I was seeing some of the still images that floated through, and they're really great images of community gatherings. And it is amazing thinking about who among those within those pictures are faces I recognize. They are leaders who have been present, who have been in conversation, who have been really curious and wrestled with what it means to strike the right balance and do this well, and have been tireless advocates of successful outcomes with largely not being rigid in the appropriate strategies. And I think that idea of this isn't about doing regulatory or non-regulatory, it's about doing regulatory and non-regulatory strategies and what's appropriate for the community. How do we move from where we are today to a positive step forward? We may not get to the ideal in this first step, but we need to be taking steps that are doable as we move forward. And I think that the community dynamic plays a major role in how leaders are supported, kind of pulled into the fold. You know, not everybody is starting out as a leader, but when they're welcomed into the conversation and empowered to voice their opinion and express the potential that they see, I think that that's where it starts. And I think making sure that we cultivate in an environment where people feel welcomed into that and supported. And that doesn't mean there are no differences. It doesn't mean that there are no conflicts, but there's, that we approach this work with good dialogue, listening to each other. And I think if we do that, the folks who aren't in these pictures today will feel great about being in them 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So I think recruitment, bring folks into the fold is really, really key.
Thank you so much for that. I really agree. Okay, so we've been through this stepwise process, and the last step was thinking about the future land use map, and now we're at this stage of implementation. We've identified the problem, we've identified our goals, we've put it into the future land use map, and now we're looking to use these tools that you as a community have selected to actually get into the implementation step. So let's watch that last video now, please.
Goals and policies.
In terms of developing an implementation plan, once you're at that stage in the process, communities can use a combination of regulatory and non-regulatory measures, depending on the sentiment of the community and what works best for them.
On the regulatory side, oftentimes looking at local municipalities, subdivision regulations is a great place to start, to be able to see if their regulations are acknowledging and recognizing the need to be able to look at a subdivision as it relates to the forest, and for the Development Review Board to be able to take into account the value of the forest when people are looking to subdivide their land. On the non-regulatory side, I think this is a place where towns can really be embracing those local relationships. It could be anything from going out and talking to your neighbors about the value of the forest, just starting that conversation and bringing it to the forefront. It can be having education workshops.
There's very strong aspirational goals at the town plan level, especially for communities that have done Act 171 planning. But actually, there's quite a bit of lag going from those aspirational goals to then actually having implementable policies through, let's say, the land use, regulatory side.
It's really important for towns to break up a big task like implementing zoning or new subdivision code.
After you've identified the actions that you want to take, you go through and you prioritize them, whether they're high, medium, or low importance, and you associate a time frame with implementation of those. And then you also delegate the task to a certain committee, a certain person, a certain community group, so that they take ownership of it and that they're able to see it through to completion.
The implementation of the municipal plan doesn't have to be all regulatory, and I think there's great opportunity for more non-regulatory actions that towns can be thinking about. This is a place where towns can really be embracing those local relationships. It could be anything from going out and talking to your neighbors about the value of the forest, just starting that conversation and bringing it to the forefront. It can be having education workshops, helping to promote the current use program, talking about property owners, about certain types of management plans they could be implementing, and providing that assistance and linking them with further technical assistance.
The list goes on, and so these are strategies that are really geared towards not necessarily saying to a landowner, hey, X, Y, or Z needs to happen on your property. It's what are your goals for your property, and if you have conservation or stewardship in mind, these are different strategies you can employ.
It's that common finish line that we're all looking to. So it's not about, it's not about how you get there, it's the fact that you get there is what's important.
A great example, the Heinsberg Town Plan has an implementation chapter. They list all the goals and policies that they've included in the plan. They assign responsibility to different parts of the municipal government. They provide a timeline and a sense of the budget. And so that's sort of taking a big ticket item like a zoning or a zoning code or even a particular policy, and breaking it up into smaller steps and assigning responsibility is a critical piece here.
I think for communities that are wondering how do we delve into this implementation, if they're feeling a bit paralyzed, that there are resources available. There's municipal planning grants where they could hire a professional planner then to help them work on one aspect of let's say, their subdivision regulations. They could work with land trusts to actually work with willing landowners in the community who are interested in land conservation. They can work with a county forester who can educate perhaps some new forest landowners who have moved into town, who may own large forest blocks and may not know about the current use program and the advantages that come to enrolling in current use. They can work with a professional planner, or Vermont Natural Resources Council, or a regional planning commission to actually work on a host of implementation steps. So if a community's not quite sure what the next step is, there are resources available to help them.
A lot of the communities I work with just get overwhelmed and feel like they need to do the change all at once, and that it's got to be right the first time. And so the first thing that I often talk about with communities is, this is an iterative process. The whole reason we've set up this video series and this 5-step sequence is because that's a sequence that towns are constantly planning with. So it's an iterative, stepwise process. And so we can take a small step in this next round of the town plan rewrite, or the zoning rewrite, or whatever it is. We can take a small step and we'll be back to it in another 8-year cycle. So that iterative process, I think, is a really important message to towns. If you're leaving this webinar feeling overwhelmed, let's just take it in small steps. And we'll just keep on moving forward. Keith, as we're bringing this to a close, what are you thinking about here?
I think, just to expand on what you were saying, is for each person, for each community, I think we can conceive of what is it that we can do that we're not doing? What's the low-hanging fruit? And it doesn't need to be the ideal. Take those steps, take those small steps, and then you're going to be in a new position, in a new place, and you can ask that question again, what's the next step? But I think that folks really they recognize that the issue is so big that the solution must be equal to the scale of the challenge. And while that's maybe true to a point, I think the timeline that we do that work cannot prevent us from making positive improvements now. And so I think, like Alex said in Heinsberg, we just can't be afraid to do it. We gotta go for it. Take the small step you can do today that is the right step, and continue to do more big, good work with your community as you move forward.
And I'll just add that it's doable. Towns across Vermont have made some outstanding progress on thinking about forest integrity and habitat connectivity with Act 171 and independently of Act 171. This is doable, and there are towns across Vermont that have done it. The Association of Vermont Conservation Commissions has this library of success stories. And when I'm feeling down, I often scroll through this list of accomplishments, the good news. And I just think, okay, if they can do it in Plainfield, well, then I can help this town do it here, and just really take some energy from the momentum that's already going on. Oftentimes, we're not aware of how much momentum is going on across the state. And so webinars like this might help us understand, gosh, there is a lot going on, and a lot of communities have done it. So with that, thank you all so much for being with us today. We really appreciate your attendance. Keith, thank you so much for your wisdom and your thoughts. We really appreciate it. And folks, don't hesitate to reach out to us if you'd like more assistance on these issues moving forward. Have a great day, everybody. A real pleasure to be with you.
Thanks all.